It's early on a Monday morning and I can't sleep, so why not discuss some of the books I've been reading in a quick, rapid fire way? When I read through a book, typically, I think about whether or not I liked the book. If I did, then it's how quickly am I going to be rereading it? It's not a hard and a fast rule, but something that I'm going to be rereading every year is something that I enjoyed a lot more than something I might read every 3 years or 5 years or more down the road. So let's get started. I started out the year by rereading The Color of Magic by Terry Pratchett, the first in his long-running Discworld series. Humorous, fantasy, in the British tradition, a lot of Monty Python-esque wordplay, that sort of thing. This book introduces us to Rincewind, the not-so-useful wizard, and the first tourist of the Disc, and his very homicidal luggage. The luggage is one of my favorite characters in the series just because it's just that wild. I love the series. It's right up there on my Mount Rushmore of my favorite humorous series of all time. I'm going to be rereading this again next year, probably around this time. Barkaba, the Jew that defied Adrian and challenged the might of Rome by Lindsay Powell. This one is harder for me. I have a rule when I'm reading nonfiction that if the contents of the book could be laid out in a magazine article, then I wonder why is it a book. Unfortunately, this book pretty much violates that. What we get here is a discussion of what we do know about this Jewish figure who rebelled against the Roman Empire, how he actually managed it for several years before he was eventually crushed. And that's really about it. The author admits that the actual sources we have are only a couple of pages, so the rest of the book is bulked out with a couple of trips he took to the Holy Land to look at the physical locations and to go check out the museums where there are artifacts associated with the revolt or the Roman Empire at that time. The writing is pretty good. I do like the author's other books. So even though it's a very marginal like, it's something I don't know that much about this part of ancient history, so it was nice to get something different. If I read this again, it'll be because I'm looking for something particularly on this era or whatever, and I'll just bang out a couple of books on the same topic at the same time. I will look for more by the author. I have a bunch in my Amazon wish list. But this one was a lesser work, let's just say. Next, it's a Star Trek book. Yes, I read Star Trek books. Yes, I find them entertaining. I know they're not great fiction, but, every once in a while we all need a little cotton candy in our lives, right? Tears of the Planets by Linda Snodgrass. She's probably best known as the author of Measure of Man, the Next Generation episode involving Data and his sentience. It's a fun little book. We start out with Uhura having a romantic fling with a composer. The Enterprise is sent to a planet outside of the Federation where there are these creatures who, when they pass away, they cry tears, which are then stored and you can create jewels out of them. Naturally, the Enterprise wants to investigate this. There's also a zone of dead space, which might be related to the planet and might not be. Of course it is. This is not a spoiler, really. There are complications. The Klingons show up. This is probably a slightly above average Star Trek book. I found it frustrating because the composer I mentioned earlier, is essentially forced onto the mission as a civilian. This makes him rather sarcastic towards Kirk and the rest of the crew, which is fine, but any tension from that is immediately thrown away because when he's called on out on his rude behavior by Uhura, he basically admits he's just being a jerk to be a jerk. And even Kirk basically says that once everything is over and settled, then he's more than happy to sign on to the man's complaint with the Federation and how they were able to do this to him. The solution is entertaining, at least. I'd probably be rereading this when I reread a bunch of Star Trek books, or it's a maybe every 3 years, 4 years, somewhere in there. Now, the one series that I read. Now, this is quite something. This is by Alan Drury. It's a 6-book series on what starts out with the U.S. Senate and kind of expands into U.S. presidential politics. This was really hard for me to finish. I read the first one mostly because I understood that it had received the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. I understand why the Pulitzer Committee at the time thought this was such great shakes. Basically, this describes what Americans, or maybe those, any kind of democracy. I'm a Canadian. We probably think this way about government, about the House of Commons too, that these are people here who don't just give speeches to give speeches. They're not just discussing their ideology. They're actually changing the opinions of their fellow politicians, and that a well-timed speech or a quip at the right moment can actually move in this case, the Senate or the Canadian House of Commons or whatever, and can actually change politics, can change people's minds. That's idealistic enough. I don't think it's terribly realistic. I think that's true of politics as they've been demonstrated, not just recently, but quite frankly, when Drury was writing these books. So many of the speeches about the greatness of the Senate and the greatness of the American democracy, it reminded me of Captain Kirk, honestly. It's kind of funny to think of them sort of in Shatner's voice as they're being laid out. The first book gets into Advice and Consent, gets into a politician who is going to be put up for the Secretary of State, and certain things are learned about his past and whatever. It was written in the 50s. I probably don't have to tell you what those things in the past are. Drury was quite the conservative. That comes through very strongly in this series. In fact, the last 2 books essentially split off into a what-if scenario, almost like fan fiction, where the president is in one a dove, and the other one he is more of a hawk. Communism, the threat of communism, is just constantly through these books, and much is made in the back copy and in some of the other reviews I read about this that they are 3-dimensional characters. We're told this repeatedly, that Drury writes 3-dimensional characters. Even his villains are 3-dimensional. I don't buy that. Pages upon pages of character background is not 3-dimensional necessarily, especially later in the series. They get very stereotypical. Drury's politics are odd, to say the least. Basically, the first book, there's a McCarthyite character, a senator, except he's from the left. Just about everyone from, the left of this political party, we're never told who's a Republican, who's a Democrat. It's all the opposition and the majority. But in the majority party, there are hawks and doves, and some want to deal with the Soviets, and some don't want to deal with the Soviets or want to have a military buildup. But everyone from the media, foreigners, civil rights activists. He has a real weird thing in one of the books with the civil rights activists. Our one main African American character spends the entire time complaining about essentially civil rights activists and how they want too much. He has a real hatred for the liberal media, which is interesting because he was a reporter originally before writing these books and making his fortune. The international community is always against the U.S. Even the French and the British are against the U.S. Canada really doesn't get mentioned, which is probably a good thing. It's just, I found it funny, actually. The villains are so evil, they twirl their mustaches and decry American exceptionalism. And I won't be rereading this again. I didn't particularly enjoy it, besides I found it funny. If you want to try a flavor of it, try the first book. But there are pages upon pages of backstory that, do we really need to know every single character's, what classes they took in college and that kind of thing? It's all too much. And I don't understand why this would have a reputation unless you're a really, really strong Cold Warrior. Something a little better after that, fortunately. The Secrets of Alchemy, which is actually a nonfiction book on, yes, alchemy in the Middle Ages and in the early modern era in Europe, particularly Western Europe. For those of you who are fans of a certain young adult fantasy magical series, let's say, yes, the Philosopher's Stone is brought up. We get some discussion of that, how the idea that it could create a substance, the elixir of life that would make you immortal, is actually something from Chinese alchemy, but at the same time is actually a mistranslation, so that's not really true. We do get a lot of discussion about turning lead into gold or turning other elements into gold, but the book is a lot more than that. It also gets into why the borderline between science and alchemy, or what we would consider magic, that barrier was a lot weaker at this time. How, Sir Isaac Newton, for instance, was very much into alchemy, and how it wasn't necessarily about just trying to make gold. It was about trying to make other elements into other elements, and how they were actually trying to fumble their way toward an actual experimental process. It's quite fascinating. So I liked it. It's maybe every couple of years, unless I develop another interest in this. It looked interesting because it's something I don't usually read about, and quite frankly, the fantasy connection, which, it was probably one reason why it was offered cheap on Kindle, was other people like me. Now to some military history. Of course, I read a lot of military history. Chancellorsville by Sears. It's a nice, thick book on the Battle of Chancellorsville. Typically, in his other writings, he usually focuses on the Army of the Potomac. This, however, we get into Robert E. Lee, and particularly Stonewall Jackson, sort of the ticking clock of his final days before his wounding by his own troops and his eventual death. The various conflicts within the Army of the Potomac, the jealousies, that all gets laid out. It actually takes a good chunk of the book. I was a little surprised. The battle itself, it cleared up a few things for me. It's a very confusing battle, mostly because of the wilderness itself. It's a confusing area to fight in, or was a confusing area. I've always loved Sears' writing. He balances nicely between first-person accounts and analysis. I'd probably read it again in a couple years. AD 381. The This is by Charles Freeman. This gets into the Roman Empire, particularly the Eastern Roman Empire, attempting to figure out just what is meant by orthodoxy, or in this case, the Trinity, and how that will be defined going forward into the late ancient period, into the early modern period, and why it was important for the governmental apparatus of Rome to do this, and how exactly they did it, and how it didn't necessarily have anything to do with, well, it only tangibly had to do with religion itself. The Trinity does not actually appear in the Bible after all. So, yes, it's religion, it's politics, it's once Christianity became the religion of the Roman Empire, how this was going to happen, how the emperor himself, and yes, it was always a him, would be in charge of, in this case, making sure that the right Christian churches receive the benefits of being the state religion. I get that he is trying to build up a larger narrative about how this was restricting to free thought in Western Europe, and how that free thought wouldn't be back until after the Middle Ages. I think it's a somewhat overstated argument. I can understand why he's making it. I wrote a book on the closing of the Western mind, which deals with that more in detail, which I'd probably read. It's a little polemical in places. I liked it. Maybe 3 to 5 years. And maybe when I'm doing a bunch of reading on the Roman Empire and on the history of Christianity and how politics involved itself in that. Next up, we have Budapest 1900 by John Ludlax. He's probably best known for his books on Churchill, the Second World War. This, you can tell it's a labor of love. It's where his family came from. It's basically, kind of like a touristy walk around Budapest in 1900. What you'd see, what the culture was like, what the arts were like, that sort of thing. He's a good writer. He can be very lyrical when he's discussing architecture and art and all that kind of thing. There are a lot of sweeping generalizations in the book, which I found frustrating. There's a lot of stuff I'm not sure where he's getting out of sourcing. In his books, there's usually 1 or 2 statements which will just completely baffle me. This one, apparently he really hates the movie Casablanca, which, okay, that seems a bit odd, but all right. We all get our opinions after all. It's a marginal, it's maybe beyond 5 years. I don't know. It just didn't necessarily grab me. But something that did, and something I wish I had read a lot sooner than I did, because I've had this on my Kindle for years and years. Crucible of War by Fred Anderson. This is mostly focused on the British Empire, at that time, the 13 colonies. We do get some on the French. This is the French and Indian War, in case you don't know, which is called the 7-Year War in Europe. We do get some discussion of what's happening in Europe, what the Prussians are up to, that sort of thing, the various alliances. But it's mostly focused on the British interaction with the native peoples, and how they conquered North America, the British did, and then how, by doing that, it exasperated tensions within the 13 colonies, which would lead to revolution. He makes a point of saying that typically the war is treated as a prequel to the American Revolution. He's trying not to do that. He actually ends the narrative I believe in 1767, I believe, 69, somewhere there. But he is showing, you still have the Stamp Act at that point. You still have the various attempts at taxation, and why the debates of the British government about why they thought they needed to do this, and how they were attempting to do it in a way that they considered fair, even though many of the colonists disagreed, and why the colonists disagreed. The first three quarters of the book is military history. We got, Wolfe seizing New France, Battle of the Plains of Abraham, that sort of thing. He has a few comments about Canadian historians, which made me smile. It's a very clear narrative. It's very detailed. This is maybe in every other yearbook. It's that good. I've had it on my shelf in print, and I've had it here on Kindle for a long time. And one of the reasons why I'm trying to go back and reread a bunch of stuff, or rather read a bunch of stuff that I haven't read before, is that I got a bunch of books in my to-be-read pile here on the Kindle, and it's time I find more treasure like this. Blood 3 Dracula, The Life and Times of the Real Dracula. Yeah, it's one of those books. I've always been kind of fascinated with how historical individuals get twisted and turned by, well, who's writing history, quite frankly. And this book really gets into that, how many of the stories about, well, all the various gruesome things were written by his enemies. And if you don't know, this is the individual that Bram Stoker's Dracula was loosely based on, and how the real one was actually the king, or prince rather, of his area fighting against the Turks, and having and the boyars, his governing class, caused problems for him, and how he was challenged by them and overthrown by them a couple of times and by relatives, and it's very confusing. And there's limited sourcing on it, and it's fascinating. It's an area I don't really read much about. So it's a like. That being said, I don't think I'll be reading the book that often. It's maybe a 3 to 5 year. It's something different if I ever needed to pick up something again. Kind of out of the blue. The Star Captains, Frigate Command in Napoleonic Wars, by Tom Wherrett, rather. I've read Forrester and Hornblower and the books by Patrick O'Brien about Jack Aubrey and the like. And so it's nice to get an actual book that deals with the actual history of these individuals and tries to go through the records and discusses advancement and whether it really was important to have friends at court, so to speak. And quite frankly, it doesn't appear to have done much good often. How long they would serve as a frigate captain, what they would do after. It seems, for instance, that most only lasted a few years before they either were moved on to something else or quite frankly, illness or the like took them away. There's a lot of statistics here. There is some discussion of ship management, the missions they were on. He points out that he's not going to talk much about the various battles because they've been covered in other books, and he makes some suggestions. It's a bit dry in places. I liked it. It's maybe 3 years, maybe something like that. And finally, for this bunch of books, we have Churchill's Secret Session speeches. These were speeches given during the Second World War. Secret in the sense that Hansard wasn't kept for them. MPs were supposed to keep them private. So these have been built out of notes that Churchill kept. which means that in one case it's kind of skeletal, in other cases it seems to be much closer to the actual text that he would have given on various topics. As France was falling, the U-boat threat. There's one here about the fall of Singapore, and finally, Torch, the landing on Africa by the British and the Americans, and trying to deal with the French and various controversies that arose from that, and Eisenhower negotiating with them and the like. There are a few flights of Churchillian rhetoric, shall we say, and that's always interesting to read. There's some little introductory paragraphs which often left me kind of annoyed more than anything else, but they do give context, so they were fine as far as that goes. Not something that you'd read unless you already knew the history. Not your first, and I picked it up because it was $2 or $3 on Kindle, and Churchill's speeches are always nice to have, and Churchill's one of those figures that I've always been interested in, so why not? And well, that's basically what I have read since the beginning of the year. $17, not bad for just a couple of weeks. I will probably do another one of these in a few more weeks. If you've liked this, if you've actually listened to my rambling to this point, thank you. Like, comment, subscribe, all that, and keep reading.